Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. For today's episode, I am joined by Jordon, the host of the 805 Uncensored podcast. Jordon, thank you for coming on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Desmond.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as is custom, whenever we have a new podcaster come on the show for the first time, which, technically you came onto a panel of mine on YouTube a couple of months ago. For those who are not subscribed on YouTube, now is your chance. Go back and check out some of those panel episodes. But Jordon has been on the podcast before on the YouTube version, his first time here on the audio version. Jordon, could you just tell everyone a little bit about what exactly is your podcast and why did you decide to start it?
Sure. So initially the 805 Uncensored just started out as a current events political podcast that I was doing with a good friend of mine when I was living up in Ventura County. Basically, we were sharing an apartment complex and we would just kind of talk about what's going on in the world. And then one day we just kind of were like, hey, maybe we should turn this into a podcast and record our conversations. Maybe somebody would actually give a shit about this. And, I ultimately came up with the name 805 Uncensored because, like I said, we were based in Ventura County. So it made sense to show that we were from there. So we wanted to bring in a local audience, but I also didn't want to just stick to only talking about local stuff. This was in the summer of 2019, by the way. Over time, my partner just became less interested naturally than I was. And so I just took over the podcast full time, but we did have a 6-month hiatus. Fast forward to 2020 and the pandemic began. And there were just so many traumatic events that were going on in the world. And I had much more free time, like a lot of other people did. And so I just decided to pick up the podcast and talk about a bunch of different things. And I quickly realized too, when I was doing the show, that people get bored just focusing on politics. And naturally, I have a bunch of other interests. And so I started incorporating music, spirituality, philosophy, a bunch of things like that. And on each episode, I have a variety of guests from various professional and academic backgrounds. I talk to authors, I talk to musicians, I talk to local activists. I've even had a few progressive members of Congress. I talked to, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name right now. He was on your podcast as well, from Kentucky, Plum Springs.
Oh yeah, William Compton.
Yes, thank you, William Compton. Great interview. Yeah, so basically, since 2020, I've been making episodes consistently. I drop a new episode every Saturday morning. My most recent episode was with Matthew Schultz. He's an author of The Dark and the Light, which is about trauma, addiction, ayahuasca experiences, and also his experiences working at sweat lodges with the Lakota and the Mayan people.
It's interesting because I know that we've already talked about this on your podcast, so we've already had this conversation, but my audience hasn't heard it yet. But your trajectory of why you started your podcast and how it kind of where it started from and where it's at right now, it's very similar to my story. It feels kind of interesting that way. But just for people to understand, obviously political podcast here. So I'm going to ask you about your politics. You have told me before that you feel very, in the framework of being anti-capitalist, of, aligning more with, ideologies like communism. Can you just tell me what led you to that point? And what's a common misconception that you hear in the media about communism, for instance, that you just finds unbearable and that you just always want to correct?
Super good questions. Okay, so I've always been aligned with the political left, as far as I can remember. But I realized that I was an anti-capitalist in 2020, witnessing the events of the pandemic. There was just, like I said, one traumatic event after another. There was obviously the virus, and then there was the George Floyd murder, and then the Western wildfires later in the fall. And I realized that all of these problems at their root are caused by capitalism. And after that, I started just engaging myself in a bunch of different leftist theory too. I started reading the Communist Manifesto by Marx. I started reading The Conquest of Bread by Kropotkin. I started reading On Anarchism by Noam Chomsky. And these were just absolutely enlightening texts to me. And in my experience, and when I talk to other leftists, the more that you educate yourself, you just kind of naturally move further and further left. And, I don't want to speak for everybody, but that's a pattern that I've witnessed with other leftists. And it's certainly true with myself. As far as like things that piss me off about like common misconceptions about socialism and communism, um, there are a bunch of them. So my first one is socialism is when the government does stuff. That's wrong. Socialism is when the workers control the means of production. Another important distinction to realize about socialism too is that it's in fact the transitionary stage between capitalism and communism. It's in the middle.
Right. Okay.
The other one is socialism is incompatible with democracy. That's wrong. You're literally democratizing the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, like these are definitely things that I've also been frustrated about when I hear about people, like especially attacks on the right, for instance. They'll say that, like, oh, whenever the government does anything, that's socialism. It's such a bastardization of the word, like truthfully speaking. But like just kind of going away from that a little bit, well, not away from I guess the talking points of it. Do you think that it actually can be implemented in America? I mean, just given the framework of what we see, like in this country, do you think that socialism or communism could actually work in this country?
So that one's a very difficult one to answer, and I can come at it from a variety of lenses, and I think that I will. So the first thing that I'm going to say is this country has obviously had two major red scares in the early 1900s and then the mid 1900s. And it looks like we might even be going into a third one with all the bullshit from Ron DeSantis in Florida, all the anti-communist stuff and anti-socialist stuff going on with the right wing right now. But with all that being said, the younger generations, millennials and Generation Z like myself, we strongly favor socialism and communism over capitalism because we're right in the middle of the capitalist hellscape. We're experiencing late stage capitalism. And what I mean by that is we're experiencing the contradictions of this economic system is not fucking working for us. Like the things that we were promised as children, that you would go to college and you would get a degree, you would eventually have a high paying job. It just doesn't work anymore. We don't live in that world anymore. And so I think that Generation Z and millennials are going to continue to move towards that direction. However, in the context of the United States, considering we have all that propaganda being perpetuated by the right, being perpetuated by the media, and even just people that are ignorant about what those concepts are actually about, it seems like the best that we're going to get in the United States is something closer to like the Nordic model of democratic or social democracy, rather, not democratic socialism. So I look at that as like a nicer capitalism where you have a much bigger social safety net, but you still have private property. You still have privatized means of production. You still have people working 9-to-5 jobs and all that.
Right. And you know what? One of the things that, I've always wondered about, I mean, I guess not so much like in the forefront of my mind, but it is definitely something that I think about. And I know that it's a common pushback on the right when they hear about this. They always, because the common framing from the right is any more power towards the government is bad. The end. Like they want to depower the government as much as humanly possible. And, if I'm being 100% honest, the government has done things that make you, I guess like a little like critical of wanting to give them more power. So there is, in my mind, that argument does seem valid, but it also does seem as though it's not really fair to the conversation as a whole. So like personally, like where do you fall in this category? If we did in fact move towards more like a social democracy, more like, Norway, Sweden, Finland, if we did move that direction, do you think that our government could handle that increase in I guess you would say power and not be further corrupted?
Honestly, I don't know, because I am a firm believer in the concept that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. Although at the same time, I think as leftists, we should be doing absolutely everything to pressure our government to be improving the material conditions of our people at all times. And if we're going to take the choice between government and corporations over which one has the potential to cause the most harm and is the most evil, right now I'm going to take corporations, especially if we're talking about America.
It's definitely an interesting place to be between, because in my mind I'm thinking to myself like, okay, like, if we do give the government more power, will they abuse it? But I also think to myself like, well, the government is somewhat, I guess, vulnerable to our outrage, because when we do get people outraged enough, some things do change, or at least they can change. Like a
Hmm.
company has no reason to actually change anything if we all get upset at them, but the government can, because I guess politicians more than anything, they're afraid of losing their power, their elected positions, so they might be more vulnerable to actually public outrage than a company would. But I don't know. These are questions that I find myself, thinking about when I think about this subject. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to have more questions with Jordon. So everyone, stay tuned. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. So before we went on the break, we were talking about, the different ideas around communism, socialism. Can they be implemented in America? I want to kind of transition a little bit right now to something a little more just contemporary as far as things that are happening today. Looking out at the news, I know that you, as well as I, constantly engaged in politics, looking at what's happening across the country. What is a particular like news story right now that currently has like captured your attention the most?
Yeah, so I actually have a few. The fact that COVID isn't going anywhere, it looks like a devastating fall and winter wave seems likely again. Climate change in the West, encapsulating a variety of crises all at one time: drought, wildfires, and summer blackouts all at once. Um, the amount of money that we've given to Ukraine as the lives of working class and poor Americans continue to get tougher and tougher. The Great Resignation, also known as workers rising up against their bosses and quitting their jobs in large numbers, basically demanding remote work opportunities, demanding much more benefits from their employers, and obviously much higher wages. It's also really pissing me off that we're placing so much focus on January 6th and the fact that there are no committees to get to the bottom of why a million Americans died of COVID, but we're doing a months-long investigation into a failed coup attempt. This isn't to say that January 6th isn't important, but I would argue that the government should be focused on improving the lives of Americans right now.
That's actually a great segue, because I want to go two different directions with this. But first and foremost, talking about the pandemic and the government's reaction to it, whether you want to focus on government under Trump, government under Biden, what do you think that the executive branch should have done differently, or maybe just the government as a whole? Just like White House, Congress, what should have been done differently that was not done or wasn't done well enough in regards to the pandemic, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of things, Desmond. First of all, I think Medicare for all should have been expanded to include every single American immediately. A study was just released from The Guardian that indicated that nearly 350,000 COVID deaths in the United States could have been prevented had the US implemented a universal healthcare system at the start of the pandemic. The stimulus checks were measly and inadequate. We needed monthly checks of at least $2,000 for every adult 18 and up in this country, $500 to $1,000 for every child throughout the entire duration of the pandemic. This is what the vast majority of the world got, but we didn't get that, obviously, and it doesn't make any sense because we're a consumer-based economy. So if you give consumers money, it's going to go right back into the economy. It's not like people were just going to save this money. There's this trope going around right now that we printed too much money and gave too much COVID money to people. We have inflation right now. That's garbage. It's because corporations are price gouging people.
No, and on obviously, I did an episode in June, talking about this specifically, talking about the rise of inflation, but how companies are purposely jacking up prices because they know they have the backdrop cover and of inflation. So that is, which, unfortunately, there are certain talking heads that like to perpetuate, falsehoods, saying that the only reason that we have inflation right now is because of government spending. When you look at the numbers, the actual government spending, I think accounts for maybe a quarter or less of current inflation. So it's definitely minuscule in comparison to price gouging. And honestly, a lot of that comes from gas prices. The oil companies
Yep.
particularly are
Yes.
gouging the American public so much that they are contributing by themselves, almost a quarter, if not more, of the inflation just on their own end. But, going beyond this, the next thing that I want to ask you, like you just mentioned January 6th and how, they
Mhm.
held meetings on that. They, made a huge like TV spectacle of this. And, the question when people were asked, like, hey, is this going to end up leading to any kind of indictments or any kind of convictions? And, the people who organized in the meetings, they basically just said no. So there's not actually like a trial that's coming after this. So it does beg the question of why. I think we already all know what happened on January 6th. So wouldn't it be more pertinent to hold meetings that are going to be talking about how we can better the lives of Americans, or how we can do something in some effect to be helping people get through this turbulent time? And that's the question I want to ask to you now. Like, is there something that the government should be doing like right now in order to helping people through this moment in time?
Uh, yeah, there's a bunch of things that they could be doing. So I would say that like a UBI would help tremendously. A universal basic income to people of like $2,000 a month, where they could afford just basic expenses, because basic expenses are not affordable right now. Universal healthcare should be expanded. Um, sorry, Desmond. I have like an entire list right here. Let me get to it. Um, oh yeah, I wanted to increase the federal minimum wage and adjust it every year according to inflation. I think that the government
Should
should
be.
be massively investing into high-speed rail right now. They should be offering tax incentives for corporations that expand remote working opportunities. And I also, this might be unpopular because I haven't heard really anybody talk about this before, but I would actually eliminate income tax for all Americans that make under 100 grand a year.
Oh, okay. What's your reasoning?
I feel like we could easily fund everything in American society and remove the tax burden from those people at the exact same time. And it will be a net benefit because those people will have that much more money and it will just go back into the economy.
Okay. It's not something that I've ever considered before. I'm not sure how that would play out, but in theory, I like the idea. And obviously, I'm asking you questions that I could probably, answer myself. Because obviously I'm asking you things like, oh, what could the government do right now? That seems like a pretty like, like no-brainer answer. I'm sure anyone who's listening right now will probably be like, why would you even ask a question like that? But particularly, the reason why I asked that question, why I've been asking a lot of these questions, is because when I have somebody else come on this podcast, I think it's, important that, there's a variety of opinions come on. Like, obviously I could answer all these questions, but I like to get a feel for how other people are seeing the world. How do you view this political landscape through your own lens, especially when it's somebody else on the left? Because the left isn't just like a homogenous thing where everyone who like votes for like Democrats or who votes for leftist candidates, all feels the same way. Like, there's so many different shades of, I guess, of what you would call leftists, or people who are on the left. And that kind of like leads me right into my next question now. As people who are on the left, I don't think that we're in the same block on the left, but we're still both on the left. Do you think that, I guess, as a whole, is the left too divided in order to like ever properly organize? Because sometimes I kind of wonder if that is the case.
So I go back and forth on this all the time. And I actually just had a recent panel about the division of the left. And I would say yes, currently, the left is far too divided to properly organize effectively right now. I will say this, though, naturally, there's always going to be a lot of contention and heated debates inside the left because the left is guided by critical thinking. It's guided by egalitarianism. And so this is going to lead to a lot of argument. Whereas the right is guided primarily by hierarchies and authoritarianism. So, like relating to authoritarianism, the right is much more willing to just kind of fall in line with their leaders, whereas the left is not going to be nearly as willing to do this. So, the debates for the left kind of center around specific policies, whereas like debates on the right tend to just center around who's in charge of those policies. And it's because the members of the right largely just agree on all of those policies versus the left, there's going to be a bunch of nuance between those things. And so, with all that being said, there's a very clear anarcho-capitalist to fascist pipeline those are tendencies that are among the right wing, but they're very close to one another, and there's a clear connection there.
Yeah, it's something that I've always wondered. You kind of like just like watching, I guess even like on the congressional level, watching these politics play out. It feels as though Republicans all seem to like, no matter what the case is, they all seem to fall in line and just kind of
Yeah.
like just they all have one united message. And you even see this on Twitter, like and in Fox News and things like that. It feels as though they're all in lockstep, the same messaging, the same kind of like talking points, the same everything. I remember in 2020, and don't even ask me why, but I ended up watching little clips of Senate debates from Senate races from all over the country: Montana, Iowa, Maine, North Carolina, like Arizona, so on. And it
Mhm.
was striking to me how every Republican senator was damn near saying the exact same thing. And it was like, wait, do you all have some sheet you're reading off of? Like, this is ridiculous. Like there was no authentic answers whatsoever. It was like
Yep.
the exact same answer to every single question. So yeah, it really it makes me wonder how the left can kind of, I guess, compete with something like that, because we are not willing to kind of just all like, I guess, fall in line and just do what everyone else is doing. So just questions I want to throw out there. But in regards to your podcast, I want to just close on this. Somebody who, when you do talk about politics, you are coming from a left perspective, from an anarcho, from an anti-capitalist perspective. What is your like take home message to people who like come to your podcast? Like when they get done listening to an episode of the 805 Uncensored, like what is it that you hope that people will take from listening to one of your episodes?
Oh, great question. I really appreciate that. So, my main takeaway is just that I want to speak to intelligent people from all over the world. And while doing so, educate and entertain my listeners and have fun in the process.
Well,
That's pretty much it.
I hope that for those of you who are interested, you'll go check it out. Jordon, where can people find you at online if they want to come check out you and your podcast?
Yeah, sure. So, definitely check us out on our social media channels on Instagram at 805 Uncensored Pod, on Twitter at 805 Uncensored. And we're on all the major podcasting listening networks, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, etc.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. For those who were interested, we will have those links in the episode descriptions, so go ahead and check that out now. If you liked this episode, please go ahead and share it on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, tag Independent Thought. Thank you so much for checking out this episode, and we will see you in the next one.